Okay, well, welcome everybody to the latest Zoom meeting on a Sunday afternoon for Leeds Theosophical Society. And this afternoon, we're going to continue with our very popular series of conversations with particular individuals who have individual interests and specialist knowledge in certain areas. And we found that this is quite a nice way of exploring ideas as well as the more conventional lectures. So this afternoon, we're delighted to welcome back a very old friend of Leeds Theosophical Society, Graham Pemberton, who's a writer, a researcher, a singer-songwriter, and does many other things as well. And he has a very broad range of interests, which we're going to try and explore some of these this afternoon, as advertised probably Christianity and possibly something about parapsychology too. So welcome, Graham, again to Leeds Theosophical Society. And when you emailed me earlier on this morning, you said that perhaps one of the things that you would like to talk about especially is this idea which you and I have discussed, and I'm sure that other people have discussed it at random times down the years, this possible resurrection of Christianity, a major kind of revolution in Christianity in which it goes perhaps back to its roots, but yet becomes something new. Now, you've had a great deal of thought about this. So what's your estimation about the possibility of this happening? And if it does happen, the means by which it will happen?
That's a great question. The likelihood is, well, it's hard to say, isn't it? It's hard to say. It depends if enough people can get tuned into what's going on while the authorities in the various organisations remain in charge and keep on pushing out the same message. It's hard to see. I mean, it's people, independent people, I guess, like us and others who are trying to come to terms with it. But then when you present the evidence to them, to the ordinary conventional Christians, they tend to reject it and say you're talking nonsense, and their version is the truth. So the question is, are we speaking mainly to non-Christians, or are we speaking to Christians, trying to get them to understand better the origins and the true origins of their religion? So as for the likelihood, I'm not a gambling man, so I'll try to bypass that question and focus upon the second half of what you said, which is what would it take to bring it about? So I've made some notes here. If you could just let me ramble on for a little bit. There was a book published in 2008 by somebody called Phyllis Tickle called The Great Emergence. She claims that about every 500 years there is a new reformation of Christianity. And she says about every 500 years, the empowered structure of institutionalized Christianity, whatever they may be at the time, become an intolerable carapace that must be shattered in order that renewal and new growth may occur. The most obvious example of that was the Protestant Reformation about 500 years ago. So we could argue that we need a new Martin Luther to come about to effect a new Reformation. So I've got some ideas about what would be needed and what would that involve. And the first one is that if the society's first principle is going to be fulfilled, we need a worldview or a religion or a spirituality to which all humanity can subscribe. So in my view, Christianity would need to become closer to the ancient wisdom, the perennial philosophy, and not see itself as separate, the one true tradition. It would therefore probably need to become more esoteric. We also need to try to understand Christianity as part of the overall evolution of consciousness and religion on the planet. So the most obvious element missing from a theosophical perspective is reincarnation, perhaps. So I've made some notes on the history of that, if you'd like to hear those. Christians will deny reincarnation, will say that there's no evidence for it in the Bible. Are they aware, however, that early Christians did believe in it, most notably Origen, one of the greatest of the early church fathers? Do they know that the soul's pre-existence, and by implication reincarnation, was dropped from Christianity? was dropped from Christianity only in AD 553 by an edict known as the Anathema against Origen, which was pushed through by the Emperor Justinian while the Pope was in jail. So therefore, a Roman emperor was responsible for the condemnation of Origen and rejection of reincarnation, not the church. It's also significant that Pope Vigilius was put in jail for protesting against a previous edict of Justinian against three other heretics, which suggests that the Pope was strongly opposed to the theology and beliefs of the emperor, yet Justinian won the day. And now it is Christian doctrine that there is no reincarnation. Christians believe this and insist on this when it began as the prejudice of a Roman emperor.
Well, that's an interesting thought, isn't it? I mean, the fact that you said that Christianity every 500 years, or you attributed this to another writer. So really, we're in for Mark 4 or possibly Mark 5 of Christianity, are we?
Well, indeed, that would be the implication. That's certainly what I'm hoping for, and believe that it's possible. It's possible. We need to work hard at it. But yes, we are certainly due, perhaps long overdue. Yes.
Well, you said that it's going to take someone of the stature of Martin Luther, perhaps, to be the prime individual who would be the focus for this. But could it be someone of even higher status than that? Someone almost of an avatar, Christ-like figure, or someone of that huge stature?
That's a great question. I suppose it could. I think it's more likely to come from a mass movement from below. Somebody like Martin Luther, I think is more likely, or a movement similar to that of Martin Luther's. If Christ was the last avatar, which I'm not sure he was, then do we believe in avatars? Do we believe in avatars like Krishna? Do we believe that God actually came to Earth, or do we perceive them as special messengers, in your view?
Well, this is one that's always, endlessly debatable. One of the things that intrigues me about all this is because certain religions, and we won't particularly name them, are much more entrenched than others. Can those religions, especially Christianity, can it still be the vehicle for a new kind of spirituality which won't share a lot of the things in common with its predecessor? So does it need to be rebranded beyond Christianity whilst enshrining core Christian ideas?
I would say yes. That's the aim. Interesting. In my notes towards what I perceive to be the end of this conversation, I've got some quotes from Carl Jung, who was saying something along those lines. Exactly that. That it needs to be rethought, revisioned, rebranded, and that then it will become much more relevant to everyone.
Do you see any signs of this happening, or is the churches becoming increasingly atomized? I mean, in America, there are tens of thousands of different registered sects of Christians of one sort or another. And this is not including the old ladies who gather on a Friday afternoon to sing a few hymns or something. There are literally thousands and thousands of these sects. And then you multiply that with all the different sects around the world. So is it so atomized now that it's actually going through its own kind of revolution anyway?
I think the revolution will come from outsiders, independent researchers. I mean, there's a lot of it about. I've made some notes for the conversation. All sorts of various researchers have gone much deeper into the origins of Christianity, where it's come from, where it started, and all sorts of different theories abound. But if you put them all together, then it certainly shifts the foundations of Christianity and makes, them far less credible, well, as perceived by the church. All sorts of writers have come up with different theories. Do you want me to go through a few of them?
Yeah, I think that would be very, very interesting, actually.
Okay, let's do that. So I'll find it in my notes. Where we go. So I've got one of the four things that I thought of would be good in terms of this Reformation would be a critical analysis of the claims of Christianity and an investigation and reevaluation. One interesting thing, which I'm certain is true, is that priests, trainee priests and perhaps vicars are taught various things in ceremonies along the lines of what I'm about to go into, but they're told not to tell the public for fear of upsetting them. You know, the public are led to believe the original story. The priests are taught things which would contradict it, and yet are told not to tell them to the public, which is interesting. So there is some kind of thing going on within the organizations, but not enough. Okay, so the first big question is, did a historical person we now call Jesus actually exist? And various researchers, as you probably know, concluded that he didn't. So a famous book is by Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy called The Jesus Mysteries. Was the original Jesus a pagan god? And the main claim is that the dying and resurrecting Saviour God is a well-known mythological theme. And along the same lines, and very interesting, it goes into more detail, is a book by somebody called Tom Harper called The Pagan Christ. And he refers to the work of three scholars, Godfrey Higgins, Gerald Massey, and Alvin Boyd Kuhn, who, he says, challenged present Christianity to the core. They have made it clear in voluminous, eminently learned works that the Jewish and Christian religions do indeed owe most of their origins to Egyptian roots. And all that research, the blunt truth is that this seismic research by a few specifically neutral scholars has been deliberately ignored by churchly authorities for many decades. Okay, Gerald Massey is the key one. He wrote 6 monumental volumes that dealt at length with the mythology and religion of ancient Egypt. And then Harper says, I will clearly document that there is nothing the Jesus of the Gospels either said or did, from the Sermon on the Mount to the miracles, from his flight as an infant from Herod to the resurrection itself, that cannot be shown to have originated thousands of years before in Egyptian mystery rites and other sacred liturgies such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and so on. So that's one theory. You then have to wonder, was there actually a historical Jesus? Just because a lot of mythological material has been added to a certain figure doesn't mean to say that that figure didn't actually exist. It's also possible to claim that the story is not of a God who became man, but rather a man who became God. Another writer called Dorothy Murdoch, who's better known as Acharya S., wrote 2 books called The Christ Conspiracy, The Greatest Story Ever Sold, and Sons of God, that's S-U-N-S, Krishna, Buddha, and Christ Unveiled. Okay, and she claimed that Jesus never existed as a historical person. This was rather a mingling of various pre-Christian myths, sun deities, and dying and rising deities. This is a theory known as astrotheology, that Jesus is actually a representation of the sun god traveling through the zodiac. But what she doesn't seem to realize or know is that the journey of the sun through the zodiac is associated with the tasks of the esoteric initiate, as explained, for example, by Alice Bailey in The Labours of Hercules, where there are indeed 12 labours corresponding to the zodiac signs. And Alice Bailey quotes Clement of Alexandria, the early Christian father, the path of souls to ascension lies through the 12 signs of the zodiac. The descending path is the same. So therefore, this raises the question, is the story of Jesus that of God who became man, or a man who became God? Are the Gospels the story of an esoteric initiate? In which case, is it an actual man or a fictional character? Is all that just an esoteric allegory? That would be another point of view.
And where do you actually stand on all this? Because, I mean, there are, these are quite diametrically opposed views in many ways. I think what is interesting from what you say is the continuity which runs from Egyptian into Christian. And of course, Egyptian itself has its roots in the Babylonians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, etc., etc. So there is this line running through it all, isn't it? Like a line of ascent, almost like a family tree. Yes. In many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I subscribe to the view that Jesus was a historical person, but not an avatar Obviously, he was a highly significant spiritual teacher. If I go on to something else, Petra's actually here, so it's very interesting that there are a couple of Petra's talks which can be mentioned. Let me just find my notes. Okay, yes, okay. So the other two big questions in relation to the historical material are: was Jesus actually crucified? And also, if he was crucified, did he actually survive the crucifixion? Which is another thing we can come on to. But this is highly significant because it's a theory supported by Petra, as people know, president of Blavatsky Lodge. I've seen her give two Zoom talks about the scholar Edmund Zeckerly, who's a very distinguished scholar, brought up in Catholicism, but his mentors, there were seemed to be two whistleblowers who didn't want to take responsibility to take on that themselves, but guided him to find some documents hidden in the Vatican Library and elsewhere. And his main discovery was that there were two Christs, or two Jesuses. One was the leader of a Jewish messianic movement, a pretender to the throne of Judea, named Johannes, and he was the one condemned to crucifixion by Pontius Pilate. The other was an Essene preacher spiritual leader, who we know as Jesus, who was captured on the same day and presented to Pilate, who released him. And this is apparently described by the historian Strabo. Okay, so, and if that's true, interestingly, that theory would resolve one of the more controversial theories about the historical Jesus, namely that he was far more militant than the way he's presented in the Gospels. That was a theme of that famous book, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and Jesus the Zealot. And also, interestingly, the Quran says that a substitute for Jesus was crucified. And then Zeckerly went on to write the Gospel of the Essenes, the Essene Code of Life, and more besides. So he therefore was profoundly influenced by what he found. I was checking out his Wikipedia page yesterday and discovered that this document that he found in the Vatican is considered to be a forgery by scholars, but you can make up your own mind about that.
I think one of the interesting things here is that over the past century, perhaps longer, but certainly over the last half century, or the last few decades since the Second World War, there has been a major reappraisal of many aspects of Christianity by the discovery of the Nag Hammadi documents, the Dead Sea Scrolls, other material too, and the ability of people to interpret these things in a way that perhaps they weren't able to in the past. I mean, one of the early ones I remember from the 1960s is the book about the Essenes being some sort of sect which took magic mushrooms. The John, I can't remember his name now.
Allegro.
John Allegro, yes. I mean, that was, one of the first ones that I found quite exciting as a teenager. But hasn't there been this process of people trying to penetrate deeper and deeper and deeper as more material becomes available archaeologically and archivally, I suppose?
Indeed. Well, that's very interesting you mentioned that, because that's one of my possible big topics for today, the magic mushrooms thing. I can come on to that, but the Nag Hammadi documents seem to have been reasonably well treated. But there is a very interesting thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls, about how long it was taken to get them published. I mean, if there's a major archaeological discovery which might challenge the foundations of Christianity, who would be the last person you'd want to be in charge of that project? Would it be somebody from the Vatican? I think not. No, Roland Deveau was put in charge of the team of scholars investigating the Dead Sea Scrolls, presumably to make sure that nothing to challenge Christianity came out. Then there was this bizarre delay for several years, which John Allegro was furiously complaining about. Now, so John Allegro actually claimed, that he was in possession. He was studying the Dead Sea Scrolls. He was in possession of material which would completely uproot the foundations of Christianity. And he then got sacked from the team and then went on to write, as you say, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Now, I've got some interesting stuff about that, which I will just find for you. If I may speak a bit at length about the role of Saint, if we may call him Saint Paul. Okay, so this will take us on to your theme of the mushrooms. He's considered by critics and perhaps by some more honest Christian theologians, to be the main founder of Christianity rather than Jesus, or at least Christian theology. He's also said to be the one responsible for the introduction of so-called pagan elements, and the one most often mentioned is Mithraism. So we have books. From a Jewish perspective, somebody called Chaim Maccabee has written a book called The Mythmaker, Paul and the Invention of Christianity. We have, if I can pronounce this correctly, Ruqayya Waris Maqsood, a Muslim. She's written The Mysteries of Jesus, a Muslim study of the origins and doctrines of the Christian church. Now, Islam believes that Jesus was a prophet, not the Son of God. And she, and I presume other Muslims, blames Paul specifically for the creation of this version of Christianity. And therefore she says that there was a need for a further revelation to Muhammad to correct the mistakes made by early Christians, by implicitly Paul. And there's another book, I won't go into details about it. It's called Christ's Ventriloquist by somebody called Eric Zuessa, or Zusa, if that's meant to be an umlaut on there. Okay, he says that Paul took with him the majority of the members of the sect that Jesus had begun and convinced them that Jesus was a god, and so on. That's the general idea. So all those writers are obviously hostile to Paul. Therefore, you have to wonder, who exactly was Paul? How did he arrive at his theology? And so what's the most important line in the whole of the New Testament? So my suggestion is that it's in Galatians chapter 1, 16 to 17, where he says that following his conversion, quote, "I did not confer with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were already apostles before me, but I went at once into Arabia, and then afterwards I returned to Damascus." He swears this as an oath. "Before God, I do not lie." Now, this all gives strong reasons to question the account of his conversion on the road to Damascus and what follows in Acts, where he is found by Ananias, who heals his blindness. He then starts preaching immediately in the synagogues. Paul himself in his epistles never mentions this account. So the burning question is, why did he go to Arabia, and who told him to go there? So, now, elsewhere in Corinthians, he mentions himself in the third person. He says, "I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell." Now, my observation is that sounds remarkably like the type of experience one has on a psychedelic drug. In modern times, probably LSD. If not, we would have to explain how such an extraordinary experience could have happened to him. Now, in more ancient times, this is more likely to have been Amanita muscaria, what we now call magic mushrooms. And this is not such a ridiculous idea as it might seem. As we were just talking about, John Allegro, having done his research into the Dead Sea Scrolls, wrote The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, where he claimed that Jesus was actually a kind of code word for Amanita muscaria, magic mushrooms. That was probably going a bit far, but the general point of the association of magic mushrooms with Christianity is credible. So what's intriguing is that magic mushrooms are depicted in lots and lots of Christian art down the centuries. Two books which go into detail are called The Psychedelic Gospels, The Secret History of Hallucinogens in Christianity by Jerry and Julie Brown, and The Mushroom in Christian Art by John A. Rush. There's another interesting book by J.R. Irwin called The Holy Mushroom, Evidence of Mushrooms in Judeo-Christianity. So we might wonder, all these artists that were painting magic mushrooms into Christian art, what is it that they knew that all the other people didn't? So my belief is we have to consider the strong possibility that Paul became part of an esoteric mystery tradition which used magic mushrooms. And if so, what was this tradition and what was its connection to Judaism?
Was this connected, do you think, to one of the mystery schools, or was it connected to the Essenes, or was it connected to both? Was it something that was practiced by a particular geographical group, or was it more a spiritually connected group, do you think?
Well, I don't know for certain. I assume, since the general idea is that Jesus was an Essene, we assume it would be an Essene. If Paul was brought up in the religion of his fathers, as he says, in the Pharisaic tradition, and he was converted to something different, then Jesus obviously had to be something distinctly different from the Pharisees. As we know, he constantly criticizes them in the Gospels. So we would have to assume, we know that the Essenes lived separately. They were Jews, so to speak, but they lived separately in their own communities and therefore obviously didn't feel completely in line with Judaism. They wanted to live their own way of life. Do you want me to give you another ramble on what the possible explanation of that would be?
Yes, I would like you to do that. But first, what intrigues me about this, from everything you've said, is that despite all these things coming along, people still retain their very crude and often fundamentalist beliefs about Christianity, and they are crude and fundamentalist, aren't they?
Indeed they are. Indeed they are.
And I came across someone not long ago, someone I've known for a very long time, and some of the things they said to me was surprising. So, I mean, it was just an observation that whatever evidence emerges, whatever alternative interpretation of the evidence is, it's not going to get through to a lot of these people anyway, is it?
No, it's not. No, they will just reject it out of hand and say it's all, well, pseudo, not pseudoscience, pseudo academics. You know, it's all well, it can't be proved. You know, it's not convincing. They'll find reasons. I mean, I've written about this Paul Magic Mushrooms Arabia thing. You know, and I get responses on Medium. You know, from conventional Christians. You know, and this thing about going to Arabia. Oh, well, there must be some reason. You know, other reason, some traditional reason why he went to Arabia and stuff like that. You know, so it's very hard to get through to them, even intelligent ones. But there you go. We have to try from the outside, do our best from the outside, convince as many ordinary Christians as we can, work on the outside. Maybe the new reformation of Christianity will come from outsiders who aren't traditional Christians.
Well, that's a very interesting thought, isn't it? Because in many ways, this is what's happened to other traditions in the past. It takes an outside source. I mean, some people may even speculate that entities from beyond this planet may be involved in these things, as well as extremely advanced individuals who are already on this planet. I mean, clearly they will be playing some sort of role in this. I mean, I'm talking about the people we refer to as the masters, for example.
Yes, indeed. Yes. I agree with you. Yes. Shall I give you an explanation as to what this sect or this group was?
Yes, I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, that's fine. No, I was stopping there briefly sorry, my scrolling has gone funny. I'm going to be back with you very soon. Okay. So we have to try and identify, if Jesus was this Essene teacher, what does this really mean? What was their background? Where did they come from? Okay. So you have a scholar like a Jewish scholar like Giza Vermes. He's very keen to persuade us that Jesus was first and foremost a Jew. Okay, so he's written various books, including a trilogy, Jesus the Jew, and so on. So the question is there any reason to think otherwise? So what follows is based on the research of a philologist and writer, scholar called Kamal Salibi in his books. First of all, the Bible came from Arabia and conspiracy in Jerusalem. Now, he took very seriously this idea of Paul going to Arabia, and this led him to do research and find out exactly what it was all about. What did that mean? What was going on in Arabia? Now, apart from his claim that much of the Old Testament took place in Arabia and not where Jews claim it did or where we think it did, and at some time there was a migration of some of them to where we now think Palestine and Judea are. Okay, so here's some thoughts I've put together. So we're all familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan. Okay, we probably all learned about this at school and didn't think too much about what the word Samaritan meant. Obviously, he was a good bloke who helped out the person on the side of the road. Okay, but some interesting bits from the Gospels are in the first chapter of John. It says, when Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael subsequently replied, "You are the king of Israel." Then in chapter 8, in John again, Jesus is having an argument with a group of Jews, accusing them in no uncertain terms that they are following the wrong religion and not recognizing him as a true prophet. And the Jews answered him, "Are we not right in saying you are a Samaritan and have a demon?" So what's happening here? The Jews mistook Jesus for a Samaritan, which according to Salibi is an Israelite sect which rejected the authority of Ezra. Now, Ezra seems to be the founder of Judaism in its post-exilic form. It's therefore interesting that the scholar Richard Friedman, having done extensive research, came to the conclusion that Ezra was the compiler or final editor of the Old Testament. Now, modern readers unfamiliar with the history may assume that the terms Israelites and Jews are more or less synonymous. At the time in question, however, there were serious differences between them. Salibi reports that in the Quran, a clear distinction is made between the Israelites and the Jews. The Israelites are depicted as the historical chosen people who were the preferred of God in their time. The Jews, on the other hand, are spoken of as an existing religious community which pays special deference to Ezra. So therefore, there is a distinct schism between two traditions of what you might loosely call Judaism. Salibi says the Hebrew Bible as we know it is essentially the product of the kingdom of Judah rather than that of the rival kingdom of Israel. It was from Judah, not Israel, that the Jews as a religious community got the name by which they are still known. Okay, so therefore, according to this analysis, Jesus was therefore not a Jew. He was an Israelite, true to what he perceived to be the original tradition. And Salibi goes much more into what he thinks are, the historical Jesus. But that's a good starting point for you as to what the original tradition might have been. They would perceive themselves as being more true to Moses, which takes you back to Egypt, of course. Moses was described in Acts as being instructed in all the wisdom and everything to do with the Egyptians. He was high up in the Egyptian hierarchy, and he therefore apparently, took the Hebrews out. So that would send you back to the true tradition beyond Judaism and Ezra and take you back to Egypt and Moses and beyond to whatever Moses learned while he was there.
Well, this is just good old-fashioned sectarianism, isn't it?
So it would seem, yes.
Yeah.
So it would seem.
And this is very, very interesting because it's almost like a story of crime families fighting it out in New York or something like that. I mean, it's a familiar pattern which plays out in human destiny in so many different ways, doesn't it?
Well, yes. I don't think Jesus will be advocating fighting in crime gangs, but I mean, it is a sectarian argument. Or, yes, it sounds a bit like that, but I think it was probably a bit more polite. Hopefully, it was a bit more polite. Hope Jesus was a bit more polite than that, if he indeed said these things.
What I was trying to get at here was the way that, I mean, to some extent, all religions, develop into these different streams and strands, don't they? Sometimes they coexist happily with each other, but more often than not, they don't, and they become more hostile to members of their own tradition than to people who you would think might be outside enemies. This is a tough nut because any new form of spirituality or world religion or whatever you're going to call it, it has to have a number of features in it, doesn't it? And one of which has to be the kind of morality which religions preach and teach but don't usually practice. It would also have to have an understanding of, the human constitution, because this seems to be the biggest problem that humanity is confronted with at the moment. People don't know who they are. They just think they're flesh and bone with something a bit vague called a soul bolted on somewhere, and which may or may not survive death. So it strikes me that any new tradition has got to really teach people who they really are, that they are essentially spiritual beings currently inhabiting a body rather than vice versa. And that's going to be a difficult one to push through, isn't it?
Indeed it is, yes. Well, I agree with you. What we're looking for is a worldview or a religion to unite humanity. I mentioned, the need for more esotericism, and I dealt with reincarnation before. But So a couple of other things that I think we need to explore. One is that Christianity would need to reconsider the nature of divinity. So, I mean, as you know, a well-known member of this parish, Theosophist Eddie Bidemoria, in his book Snake and the Rope, says that there are 4 crucial misunderstandings that must be cleared before there can be any hope of genuine and sustainable progress. And the first is the notion of an external anthropomorphic creator God who performs according to his fancy, as preached by the exoteric religions. So we need a re-evaluation of the nature of divinity, and it's not hard to find it. I mean, we can go to Kabbalah, we can go to Hinduism. The ancient wisdom traditions perceive God not to be a personal anthropomorphic God. We talk about Brahman, for example, as the ultimate consciousness, if you prefer, or whatever word you prefer for that, the absolute principle, the eternal consciousness. That would be one major thing that Christianity would need to do, would be to get rid of this idea of this God who seems to intervene in history and things like that, would be my view. And so, briefly, the divine feminine would have to be considered. But more importantly, that the absolute being, the source of what we in the absolute being, the source of what we call evil as well as good exists. Now, both of those changes were advocated by Carl Jung, as I mentioned in my talk last Easter Sunday. Anyway, I'll focus on the second point. So Christians believe that God is good and ascribe everything to evil, to Satan, or to human's original sin. But if the absolute is the ultimate source of everything that exists, then this must include what we call evil. And on that theme, the latest edition of Esoterica magazine contains an article by John Algeo called The Dark Side of Light, including this quote from The Secret Doctrine. He says, "Homogeneity is one and indivisible, and heterogeneity in its dualistic aspect is its offspring, its bifurcous shadow or reflection, so that divine homogeneity must contain in itself the essence of both good and evil." That's The Secret Doctrine, Book 1, 411-12. So I assume that would be the theosophical position. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I mean, I think this idea of, having an emanationist approach, if that's the correct word, rather than the creator God principle, is a very important one, because
Absolutely.
This idea of the human-like God, the anthropomorphic God, is one that is incredibly misleading, and it leads to huge distortions in people's consciousness, doesn't it? And so to demolish this thing, which, to be fair to her, Madame Blavatsky was one of the demolishers in chief of all this, trying to get rid of this notion of the anthropomorphic God. But we've still got, I guess, a long way to go in convincing people that the absolute is something rather more refined than all that.
Yes. And the problem is, of course, that the God as perceived by the Christians, the anthropomorphic creator God, is the source of much condemnation by atheists and secularists and humanists. I mean, they mock that, but they don't consider the deeper understanding. So it's easy to mock the Christianity and claim to be an atheist when you haven't even considered the deeper traditions. And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, Hinduism is still very prominent in the world, and Buddhism, which has something similar to Hinduism, although the notions about the absolute may be slightly different. But those sorts of things. And the Kabbalah, of course, has exactly the same idea of the Ayin and the Ein Sof, as the Ayin is the ultimate equivalent of Brahman and things like that. So, if atheists and people who reject theism could only, go more deeply into the subject, they may be another source of people that could be convinced. Perhaps. I'm not too hopeful, but
one of the things that I find most powerful about the ageless wisdom tradition, but in particular the way that Theosophy has chosen to highlight this, is this idea of the powers latent in man. I mean, we are told by many religions, particularly Christianity, you're weak, pathetic, sinful creatures, you ought to suffer. You're not here to enjoy yourself. You should be miserable, blah, 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 all that. And then this incredible self-limitation, which people are taught to self-impose on themselves. The idea that it says in that third object to study the powers latent in man and the hidden secrets of the universe. One would hope that part of this new Christianity or mystery tradition or whatever it's going to be would absolutely enshrine this at the heart of it, that human beings are gods in the making, where we're doing an apprenticeship for Godhead as we speak. And therefore, we shouldn't, demean ourselves and just cave into all these archaic Christian notions about what terrible people we are.
Indeed, yes. And this is perhaps, why the Eastern religions, have become a source of fascination for Westerners. Having rejected Christianity, they look at the Eastern traditions, the gurus, the masters in various things. So Buddhism is very popular in the West. The Hindus seem to be more aware of the hidden powers. I think they call them siddhis, which you develop on the path to enlightenment or the path to Godhead. They tend to say, I think they say, don't take them too seriously. Don't get preoccupied with them. They're just things that will develop. But ultimately your goal is beyond that. But they are interesting while you're on the path, I would say. You're aware of my experiences with parapsychology and ESP. And that was a source of great fascination for me.
Yes, well, this is where I was hoping that this would seamlessly take us from Christianity to hidden power to these noetic sciences, parapsychology, something which you were fascinated by, which a lot of people are very, very interested in, myself included. So these powers are there and they are provable, and they are presumably evolving powers in humans, are they?
I presume if you're doing the spiritual work, then they would be evolving powers. My own experience was slightly different. Let me just say, I was probably somebody ripe for spiritual transformation. And so I was starting in a depressed state, having followed some what I would call false philosophies, existentialism, all that sort of stuff, the gloomy French writers and things like that. So I ended up in a bit of a desperate pit and was looking for a way out and started looking inwards, you would say. And then once I decided to look inwards, a sort of a combination of circumstances came together to wake me up, so to speak. And one of those was a friend of mine just noticed an advert in Time Out, if you know what that is, in London, Time Out magazine, advertising a parapsychology course. So we went to the initial meeting, just to, obviously the man wanted to test us to see that we weren't nutters, that we were serious. And so there was an initial meeting, so you could choose to sign up for the course or not. So we both went to the initial. She chose not to go on the course. I did. And then the world sort of exploded. Some people say when you're doing things like this, the moment you sign up is when the course starts. Now, for some reason, that was in January, and I signed up for a course starting in March. But between January and February, it already started happening. So it's like once I was signed up for the course, it started happening, and all sorts of weird stuff was happening. And then I did the course and became, a convert to parapsychology and ESP. So it was an act of grace, you could say. It wasn't something that I was looking for. It was an act of grace which came my way.
Can you tell us what sort of things were going on in this interim period between signing up and actually embarking on it?
Well, I was getting very, very powerful dreams, which were obviously way beyond anything Freud was talking about. Synchronistic events. I was reading about lots of Jung at this point, and synchronistic events, weird things like that. I think probably the actual parapsychology didn't come. It's a long time ago now, so I can't remember in detail. But those were the sorts of things. Very powerful dreams, weird synchronistic events were certainly part of it.
One of the things that I find very interesting is the way that materialistic science goes out of its way to try and debunk these things, despite the fact that people like Dean Radin, the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in America, has done something called a meta-analysis of every single parapsychological experiment done over the last 70 or 80 years, and has drilled down in minute detail into all this. Even though it shows chances of millions or billions to one, it still doesn't convince the skeptics. This is another problem, isn't it? Because in a scientific parallel way, it's similar to the problem you have with people of deep-seated fundamentalist religions, except happening in the spiritual or scientific sphere rather than the religious sphere.
Yes. Okay. Well, there's nothing quite like personal experience. You can believe what you like. You can read all the books you like. You can be as skeptical as you like. When you've had personal experiences, there's no reason to doubt, is there? I mean, once it's happened to you, how can you doubt it? I haven't copyrighted this yet. I've got a sort of a theory of a couple of lines for a song, which I haven't yet put together into a song. It's something like, goes something along the lines of, if what had happened to me had happened to you, you would not believe the things you do. Ooh. So it's not in a song yet, so I'm going to copyright it immediately before ever you nick it. So.
Right. Well, have you ever had any experiences that might be described as precognition, seeing events in advance of them actually happening in a dream or in some other way?
Well, one of the experiments on this parapsychology course was dream telepathy, and the idea was that so dream telepathy. He announced we were doing this on a Wednesday, and he said that on the Saturday night he had 6 envelopes with pictures inside them, and he would choose one at random and focus upon it. And then, well, that's the idea. Then the following Wednesday, we had to report. Well, he showed us the pictures, and we had to report whether we had seen anything vaguely, remotely like anything in those 6 pictures. Okay. Now, I had a very, 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 very strong experience. At that time, I was doing sort of personal psychoanalysis and things like that, and a very powerful dream happened during that week. So I think he also said, the man said, it doesn't matter whether you've had the dream before Saturday or after. Yeah. So the dream could happen any time in the week, even before I've chosen the picture. Yeah. Even before I've chosen the picture. So from my memory, I had this dream on the Thursday before he chose the picture. Now, in this dream, a baby was being swallowed up by something like a shark or a whale, something like Jonah in the Bible. So it was as if this baby was being put into the mouth of a whale, and it was being swallowed up and digested, presumably disappearing into the mouth of a whale. Okay, and then you can judge for yourself. I mean, he said any connection at all. So on the Saturday night, he chose a picture, and one of the pictures that he chose was he was on a ship at night, and there was a baby on the deck of the ship, unattended by its parents, and it was sort of just wrapped in its clothes, just lying on the deck of a ship. And at any moment, if this ship had turned, it could have gone into the sea and been swallowed. So I thought that was a fairly strong connection of a dream telepathy.
And what about telepathy? Because this, I think, goes on a lot more than people actually recognize. People, particularly people who have close contact with one another in particular professions, in husbands and wives or other close personal relationships, brothers and sisters and so on. Do you think this is something which we perhaps had more of in the past, have lost, and are perhaps now rediscovering in some way?
Yes, depends who you mean by we. I mean, primitive, so-called primitive tribes, are apparently quite telepathic. So they haven't perhaps reached the same level of consciousness as we have now, but they apparently are quite telepathic. So men can go off hunting, and their wives know when they're coming back, and they know what they've caught and things like that, as reported by, I think, Lawrence van der Post in his books, I think, and other people probably. So at the tribal level, it seems to be more prominent than it is amongst us. But it's happening now unconsciously. I mean, we don't have to do a conscious telepathy experiment. I mean, things like, you suddenly sense that somebody's about to ring you, and then they ring you and things like that. So that sort of thing is quite common, I think. You get the feeling that the phone's about to ring or something like that. Which it must be some form of unconscious communication, and it's quite common in children. I think when I gave my talk on parapsychology to you at Leeds, I mentioned how it's much stronger in children up to about the age of 8. They're much more psychic and can tune into what's going on. There was an example of a young boy, aged about 2 or 3, could imagine he can only just speak. At breakfast, he suddenly said, "Dad's just had a motorcycle accident," to his mother, but he's okay. And that turned out to be precisely true and things like that. So I think we're born with it. The process of rationalization, developing a critical mind, critical faculties, tends to shut it down. But it's much more common amongst children. Therefore, it's something which we could regain. And also, tribal societies seem to have a much better telepathy connection than we do. It's something we can regain. You can train yourselves. There are courses on the internet, training in parapsychology and stuff like that.
Have you done very much research, Graham, into this phenomenon known as psychokinesis, moving objects by mind power? This was something I believe the Russians got interested in during the Cold War, probably the Americans too, and no doubt the British and everything. Have you done much research into this?
I haven't done any personal research. The person that gave this parapsychology course that I attended claimed that he'd once been in a room of people orientated like him, where tables started flying around. Actually, furniture was moving, of its own, free will, if that's the right term. Not, which he thought was pretty frightening. There's obviously the work on psychokinesis. I mean, poltergeist phenomenon obviously involves moving things, and some people and some researchers. I think it goes both ways. Some researchers think that's an unconscious phenomenon, often by a teenage girl. So that would be a teenage girl is, because of her emotional turmoil or whatever, is unconsciously making things move. But I think there are also genuine cases of poltergeists, which would explain why things were moving. I mean, that Enfield haunting case is a particularly notable one, extraordinary story of the Enfield haunting, those 2 girls in their house with things flying around and things like that. But that's obviously, when we talk about psychokinesis, we really mean a human being is consciously affecting a physical object. That's as far as I know on that subject.
Well, I mean, it strikes me as being quite interesting, because there is this phenomenon which many people are aware of, that when they get into a particularly agitated or angry mood, they do start on some occasions to interfere with objects around them, particularly cars won't start, computers start to go wrong. Other pieces of sophisticated machinery are getting affected by something emitted from you. And, people talk for a long time have talked about the gremlins in machines as if these things are somehow personified. But clearly human beings do. If we believe in all our power of consciousness, and that consciousness that exists beyond the brain, which most of us do, then clearly, we can interact with machines. And I suppose this also brings in another fascinating aspect of all this, remote viewing, which was something that the spy agencies loved, because they could just go and have a peep in the safe in the Kremlin and see what the Russians were up to.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, an alternative explanation, you say humans have this apparent connection with your computers or your car or whatever it is, which makes them not start. I mean, an alternative explanation would be some kind of non-physical entity was doing it in order to draw attention, to make a connection. It's like a sort of synchronicity, isn't it? So if you talk about things like Jungian synchronicities, I mean, the famous example of the scarab beetle that Jung talks about. Yeah. So, I mean, what's making the beetle turn up at the window at that precise moment? Is it the woman's dream, or the fact that she's telling him, is that drawing the scarab beetle there? Or is there we talk about the interconnectedness of the whole universe. Is there something about the whole universe and its the fact that it's a living organism, which is drawing the scarab beetle there, and it's not actually her that's doing it. The purpose of it is to wake her up and to get rid of her materialistic mindset, and it had the desired effect. But what actually is drawing the scarab beetle there? I'm not sure it was her or her unconscious mind. I mean, something I would ascribe it to a bigger power personally, a different sort of power. God knows what it is, but.
Well, I think on that particular note and on that particularly big question, I think we'll draw things to a close, because we've drained, I think you drained your knowledge this afternoon, which is very deep and extensive, and we thank you very much indeed for that, Graham. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. I do think this is a good way of drawing things out and presenting particular ideas. Thanks once again for tuning into Leeds Theosophical Society. So bye to you all now.